This is the story of Elisha and the two bears. And Elisha went up from thence unto Bethel. And as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city, and mocked him, and said unto him, Go up, thou bald head! Go up, thou bald head! And Elisha turned back, and looked on them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth two she bears out of the wood, and tore 42 children of them. And Elisha went from thence to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. The end. Now, wasn't that a wonderful bedtime story? So, kids, what did you learn? Let me switch gears with this question instead. If an atheist asked you about this story, or even a confused, troubled believer, how would you respond? How about this? Are you yourself a little troubled by hearing the story coming right out of the Bible? Well, maybe it's just the KJV wording and modern versions have cleaned it up a little bit. Nope. Every other version you come across will say use. So, the Christian artist who made these presentations and all other online portrayals are just following how every translation describes the 42. The one here on this Christian children's YouTube channel shows exactly how most imagine the characters in the story, and it's not shocking that they turned off the comment section after posting this video, and yet it's still up and running. So, in a nutshell, 42 kids got killed for calling Elisha bald. Are any of your stomachs out there just a little twisting over this? Maybe just a little bit, I hope. Well, don't worry. Let me untangle them because there is a lot more going on underneath the hood here than meets the eye to the modern day reader. Because by themselves, this is an easy mortar shell for the online village atheist to fire against believers. Because how can an all loving God send two bears to kill 42 little young children just for mocking an old guy? Right? Over the last 50 years, Americans identifying as Christian has dropped from 90 to 63%. As shown in the charts, the trends are not linear, they're just falling off a cliff. Christianity is very unlikely to be the majority self identifying religion in just one more generation in the US. Europe isn't faring any better either. This is basically showing that kids in their early 20s throw in the towel on their faith and never come back. All of them have varying reasons for doing so, but one of the reasons that some will claim that cause their faith to completely crumble is when they read a story like this, which becomes completely irreconcilable to them over the idea of an all loving God. So let's get underneath the hood of this story by doing a deep dive into what the text actually says by first addressing the portrayal that Elisha was some crotchety old man who couldn't take a joke from a bunch of second graders. Now, in order to dismantle this very common portrayal, and just let me be very blunt here, is that it's 180 degrees off from what it actually is about, is that we have a lot of unpacking of the immediate and surrounding text of Second Kings 2 and the ever enjoyable task of weeding through biblical chronology as well. Why chronology matters is because of the portrayal of Elisha as some old prophet. I'm sure that our brains typically think of like some 80-year-old Moses like when thinking about Old Testament prophets. They're always gray haired, long beards. They can barely walk. They need the walking stick. Just basically, Charlton Heston, Exodus all over in their head. Um, But the thing is about that, you got to completely erase that out of your head. Case in point, Jesus. Jesus was a prophet. And how old was he at the very most when he died on the cross? 33. He was a prophet, and at the end of the day, a prophet is a calling by God, and it can happen at any age. Jeremiah got called as a kid, so did Samuel. They were a prophet from that very moment. So you got to erase that image out of your head. So, how old was Elisha at this point? Well, broadly, we know that the kingdom period roughly covered 500 years from King Saul to Jerusalem's destruction. This period is covered primarily by 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You can see the reigns of the kings in both the south and north and where the prophetic books fit in within there. Since Elisha's ministry is only found in 1st and 2nd Kings, that is where we'll find the chronological clues needed to get a sense of how old he actually was in the Two Bears episode. In 1 Kings 19:16, we see him appear with God telling Elijah to go anoint him as a prophet under Elijah's wing. 2 Kings 13 describes his death. So, we textually know where his call and his death are located in the stories. What we can do with those is fit them within and nearby verses that describe a certain year of a king's rule. So, Elisha's start occurred somewhere between 874 to 853 BC, and his death near Joash's second year. Dating Elisha's death to 798 BC is pretty well locked in, as Joash was king when he visited Elisha's sepulchre, as it occurs right before 14:1's description of his second year. I hope that makes sense. His start can be narrowed down by looking for more references to Ahab's ruling years between chapters 16 and 22, and see where 1916 is in relation to them. So, we know Ahab began ruling in 874 BC. The next ruling reference to his reign is in 2241 in his fourth year, which means this verse can be dated to 870 BC. We can narrow down further by the fact that Elijah pronounced a 3-year drought, and 18:1 refers to the third year of the drought. That means Elijah's deity battle with the 450 Baal prophets occurred around 871. So, Elisha's anointing occurred somewhere near 870 BC, because after Elijah defeated the 450 Baal prophets, he has to flee from Ahab and Jezebel and ends up going to Mount Horeb. That's where he gets instructed to go and anoint Elisha to be a prophet. So, since we both know his start and death with strong accuracy, is that we know that roughly 72 years was the length of Elisha's ministry, which means he couldn't have been more than 40 years old when he got called by Elijah, as that would make him over 112 on his deathbed if you go above 40 years. This is validated by the descriptions of him working with his parents in the field when Elijah showed up. He didn't have a family of his own. He left his mom and dad's farm and followed Elijah. With all of this is that we can narrow down in the same fashion to figure out when the Two Bears episode occurred. This task goes a lot quicker, as that episode occurred during Ahaziah's very short rule. The episode comes right before Jehoram begins to rule, so we can place the event in that 2-year span of 853 to 852 BC, which means Elisha is somewhere in his 30s to 50s right now. And I think it's much more reasonable to go with the younger end because of the description of him leaving his parents with no record of him being married with kids. He was not a patriarch of a family at this point. This chronological demonstration strikes down the idea of him being some elderly man, but someone near 40. Now, since we can mentally pull down the image of Elisha by 40 years in our head, what do you think the chances that the so called 42 children are actually much older than how we imagine them to be? As for the elementary age portrayal, is that when you simply lift up your eyes in chapter 2, is that you realize that this story is coming right off of the heels of Elisha's ascension into heaven. Now, why is that relevant to our story here? Well, who remembers what the so called kids said mockingly to Elisha? Go up, go up. That language shows that their mocking is in reference to Elijah's ascension. They don't believe the story that he was taken to heaven. So, if the go up language is tied to Elijah, what do you think the chances are that the bald head language is as well? Yep, it's pretty high. It has nothing to do with the idea that Elijah looks like George Costanza from Seinfeld. And we know that because going back to the beginning of chapter 2 is that verses 1 and 2 describe Elijah and Elisha's journey between Gilgal and Bethel. Now look at verse 3. And the sons of the prophets that were at Bethel came forth to Elisha and said unto him, You know that the Lord will take away thy master from thy head today. And Elisha said, Yeah, I know it. Hold your peace. Guys, the bald head language makes perfect sense now. It's in reference to the fact that Elisha is all by himself now. The bald language is tied to the fact that tied back to 1:8, where Elijah was described as a very hairy man. So, since Elijah's hairy master, who was the head of him, just like Christ is the head of the church, is now gone, is that Elisha now has a bald head. Guys, when in doubt, zoom out. Just looking at the prior chapter, or prior text at least, will very likely bring clarity with repeated words that come up that lets us know that the author is tying these things all together. Never get shook up by someone on YouTube or TikTok that thinks that they can just post a 20-second, look how I easily defeated the Bible. Boom, it's all done. No, it's never that simple. So, seeing this textual relationship now, what do you think are the chances that verse 3's group and 23:24's group, who were both mocking Elisha in some manner, are related to one another? To find out if that thought holds water is that we need to continue to move forward in chapter 2, and instantly we see that verse 4 basically repeats verse 2's dialogue. But this time, Elijah and Elisha journey from Bethel to Jericho. And there again, Elisha encounters another group called the sons of the prophets. And guess what the conversation goes like? It's the same thing that happened in Bethel. So, there's a second group in the broader narrative to be aware of here. One is from Bethel, and the other is from Jericho. Now, something to notice with these verses is that the phrase, the sons of the prophets, is that that's a reference to men who are part of a specific group. The New English Translation Bible, NET, refers to them as being part of a prophetic guild. This guild is just like the Writers Guild or other guilds of today. This was essentially a school where a lead prophet trained and developed new prophets. If you look this up, You will see that this phrase appears in a number of places in the Bible. First is with Samuel, as most scholars see as the one who initiated this type of training. It's not exactly the same thing as someone today going through seminary school, but it's kind of in the same line of thought to train and equip future pastors. And like always, I'm not making this stuff up. You can find plenty of articles on this, and so you know that I'm not just going on my own here. And when you look back at Elijah at Horeb, complaining about the prophets being killed, is that God's reference to the 70,000 left in northern Israel that are still faithful to him are actually referring to the prophets. This isn't just about just modern, just regular old people, citizen believers. The words son and father in the Old Testament have a broader range of meaning than just biological relationship. Case in point, Elisha himself. He referred to Elijah as his father. Yet, we know definitively, biologically, he was the son of Shaphat. So, when we scan for other references to the phrase sons of the prophets, is that we can glean some clues on their approximate age, with 2 Kings 4:1 showing an example of one of these men married with his own children. They weren't elementary age. This isn't Star Wars with the younglings in the Jedi temple having to get raised from essentially birth to, till they became a Padawan and Jedi of their own. 438 shows there was a group in Gilgal, the first spot in Elijah and Elisha's journey. In the story of Nahum the Syrian, Gehazi, one of Elijah's prophets who got greedy, refers to young men from Mount Ephraim's school of prophets. 6:1 refers to the prophets following Elisha with the floating axe story. And a final reference in 9:1 with Elisha calling for one of the sons of the prophets and to send him on an important missional task. Elijah was obviously sending a grown man on this task, not some 8-year-old. Taking that understanding back into chapter 2 is that it gives us a better mental picture of these guys. These antagonistic groups are following Elijah and Elisha around and waiting to see what happens to Elijah. Verse 6 describes the final leg in the journey for Elijah and Elisha to go across the Jordan River. In verse 7, we are told that 50 men of the prophetic guild kept a good distance away, but essentially kept spying on Elijah and Elisha to see what was going to happen to Elijah. It's interesting to see the number 50 show up here, while we know 42 is the number in verse 24. The number 50 comes up a lot in 2 Kings chapter 1, as King Hezekiah sent 3 captains of 50 men each to get Elijah. The first 2 groups, Elijah called down fire from heaven to consume. The third captain kind of woke up and realized what's going on here and that he was really a true man of God. And he just fell before Elijah and just begged, don't bring fire down on us too. And because he knew what was going to happen off of the first 2 examples. It's this story that the disciples of Jesus reference when they ask him if they could call down fire from heaven to consume the Samaritan village that rejected Jesus. So, the fact that the number 50 appears repeatedly is telling us that the author, probably Jeremiah, is trying to make a literary connection between these 2 stories, just like he was doing with the bald head comments. Chapter 2's ascension is really more about Elisha than Elijah. And I know that might sound weird, as Elisha was the one who was literally picking up the mantle of Elijah as the next main prophet of God. It's more of a transition story than anything. The story continues with Elisha and Elijah making, it across the Jordan, with Elijah parting the Jordan, just as Joshua and Moses did at the Red Sea. Or Moses did at the Red Sea, Joshua did the Jordan. Elisha asks for a double portion of Elijah's power. Elijah says it will happen if you actually see me go into heaven, which Elisha did, and received Elijah's robe when he threw it off the chariot. Now, Elisha's first miracle is that when he, has to get back to Jericho, is that he now has to part the Jordan River. At this point, the Jericho school of prophets realized what that meant and bowed before him. They didn't see Elijah's ascension, but they did realize that the Jordan was just parted for Elisha and what that all meant. Verse 16 now. And the Jericho group said unto him, Behold now, there be with thy servants 50 strong men. Let them go, we pray to thee, and seek thy master Elijah, lest perhaps the Spirit of the Lord hath taken him up and has cast him upon some mountain or into some valley. And Elijah said, You shall not send. There is that number 50 again. And here, this 50 are called strong men. Heads up, it's not a throwaway description. Verses 17 and 18. And when the Jericho prophets kept urging him till he was embarrassed, Elijah said, Fine, send. So the Jericho prophets sent therefore 50 men, and the 50 men sought 3 days, but did not find Elijah. And when the 50 men came again to Elisha, for he was staying at Jericho, Elisha said unto them, Didn't I say unto you, don't go? From those 3 verses, we again see 2 groups, the Jericho prophetic group and the 50 strong man group that was sent out as a search party for Elijah. Reminder that up in verses 3 and 5, we saw 2 groups there as well, who were both mocking Elijah that he's going to lose his master soon. The Jericho group from verse 7, who were composed of 50 men as well, but stood afar back and watching for both the Jordan and watched the both Jordan River crossings. And verses 16 through 18, a second 50-man group was there. Is anyone making the dot connections here between all of this? It's the prophetic group from Bethel. Their desire to go search for Elijah's body all goes back to their initial mocking of Elisha from verse 3. They want to find the body to show that Elijah is a fraud, or worse yet, a murderer who buried Elijah's body and stole his robe in the process. They don't want to accept the truth. And this explains why they spent 3 days looking for Elijah's body. Why 3 days? Where do we hear that? So Elijah's response to them was basically, I told you not to go because you're just going to waste your time trying to prove me wrong. You see, if you just zoom out and see that chapter 2 is a continuous story from top to bottom, focused on the transition from Elijah to Elisha, is that you can see how the narrative and the characters within it all flow together from beginning to end, that finishes with the Two Bears episode. I have to imagine that you're starting to see where I'm going with all this. But let's not jump the gun and let's just keep letting the text speak for itself. Verse 18 reminds us that Elisha is still at Jericho, as verses 19 through 22's episode has the men of Jericho asking Elisha to heal their waters, which he did. Now, I think I'm asking an obvious question at this point, but who are the men of Jericho that came and asked? It's the Jericho group, prophetic group. And what other group is still in town? The unbelieving antagonistic Bethel group. This takes us right into the Two Bears episode again, and look how it starts off in verse 23. And Elijah went up from Jericho unto Bethel. Elijah's whole journey in the narrative is now reversing course from across the Jordan River to Jericho and going back to Bethel. Continuing on in verse 23. And as Elijah was going up to Bethel by the road, there came forth little children out of Jericho, and mocked him, and said unto him, Go up, thou bald head. Go up, thou bald head. The picture is now complete of who the so-called little children were. It's the prophetic group from Bethel that initially mocked Elisha going back to Bethel in verse 3. And who went out trying to prove Elisha wrong by finding Elisha's body. And regardless of the fact that they couldn't find the body after 3 days, they still didn't believe Elisha. Guys, this is the same thing that unbelievers do when attempting to undermine the resurrection story. When critics can't find any evidence to prove Christians wrong, they just start mocking it instead. Now, you might be wondering, then why call them little children? It's because the author is now taking a jab at them. In verse 16, the Jericho prophets called them strong men. And what's the opposite of being a strong man? A little child. The Bethel prophets did the same earlier type of jab with their bald head remark to Elijah that was alluding to the hairy Elijah. I know, got to keep saying all this stuff. Just it's tough to remember all of it. Now, it's the author's turn to take a jab at the Bethel group. Both Hebrew words for little child can imply something other than an allusion to their age, as katan is used frequently describing something with a lack of significance or a lack of strength, i.e., the opposite of a strong man. Na'ar comes up most times as lad in the KJV. Ishmael was called this at the age of 18 to 19. Joseph was 17 when he was referred to this. And it can even refer to someone as a servant, like Gehazi was to Elijah. Both of these were used together when Solomon referred to himself as a little child when taking on the king role when he was likely somewhere between 20 to 25. This demonstrates that the author was poking fun of them. And it strikes down the idea of them being a bunch of young kids. And what the whole of the text describes is a group of men, likely with the same age range as Elisha, in their early 40s. So, the modern versions aren't necessarily wrong when they say use, but I think they need to upgrade the conveyance for the reader in their translation. And so, after 3 times of dealing with this unbelieving, antagonistic group of prophets from Bethel, who are very likely becoming a threat to Elisha's own life, is that Elijah has had enough of them, with verse 24 saying the following. And Elijah turned back and looked on them and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And just like with Elijah calling on the Lord to rain down fire from heaven, is that God sent forth 2 female bears and mauled 42 of the Bethel prophets to death. On the literary side, the commentators for the Expositor's Bible saw that 2 Kings author lined out chapter 2 in a chiasm where points in the story are connected to one another. An easier example to see this at work is in the book of Daniel's Aramaic section of chapters 2 through 7. The chapters form an A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime chiasm where there's a working in and a working out, with chapters 2 through 7 falling into place as so. And this means that chapters 2 and 7 are connected, 3 and 6 are connected, and 4 and 5 are connected as well. Chapters 2 and 7 are the easiest ones to see this connection, as both are describing the 4 Gentile empires that start with Babylon and end with Rome. With this understanding is that points B and B prime in 2 Kings 2's chiasm are thus connected to one another. That means the school of prophets at Bethel are the little children from verses 23 and 24 who get mauled by the 2 bears sent by God. Now, if I'm really right about equating the Bethel prophets with the 42 children, then why is it 42 and not 50? Shouldn't the numbers be the same if they are the exact same group of people? Not necessarily. And the text even demonstrates that the 42 who were mauled were part of the 50 Bethel prophets by the ending in verse 24b saying, of them. Who's the them? It's the 50 strong men from the Bethel prophetic group. And this prepositional use is reflected in all modern day versions. Out of these, Young's literal translation helps us the most as it demonstrates the ordering of the Hebrew words. The phrase of them in Hebrew has the noun hem inflected with the preposition men in front of it. This is done 662 times in the Old Testament. It is what it is, of them, meaning a part of them. When the Greek-speaking Jewish translators saw this, they did the same thing as well in the Septuagint with ek autos, as ek is a Greek preposition. This textually solidifies that the 42 mauled were coming out of the 50-person Bethel group. And just to drive this point home even more, is that 42 is not coincidental, as later in chapter 10, 42 is the number that King Ahaziah of Judah's evil brothers were killed by Jehu, who Elijah was told by God at Horeb to anoint as king. And we already saw that's where God told Elijah to anoint Elisha as prophet as well. Verse 17 describes that Jehu's and Elisha's main task is to rid the land of idolatry and all of those who were connected to the house of Ahab and Jezebel. So, the fact that both are described with 42 evil men being killed shows that they are 100% connected and intertwined, that all goes back to God's directions given to Elijah at Horeb. This, I believe, is why John in Revelation describes the length of the Antichrist rule in 42 months. He is the only author in the Bible that brings up Jezebel, and by using 42 months, when he could have just kept using 1,260 days or time and times a half of times, is that by bringing up the number 42 and Jezebel altogether, is that he wanted to get his readers light bulbs flashing in their heads, to get them to go back to Ahab and Jezebel's time in order to get them a better sense of how corrupt the world will be when the Lord returns, and he too has to rid the earth of idolatry and evil men. This makes even more sense when you think of the two powerful prophetic witnesses in Revelation, just as Elijah and Elisha were two powerful prophetic witnesses in that time as well. And just like Revelation, 2 Kings 2 describes how at the end of the day, there are just two types of people in this world: believers and unbelievers. We all start off as unbelievers, but between those two endpoints, God keeps sending his message and messengers and everybody else that he can to the unbelieving world to call them into repentance and bring them back into the fold. Whether a person accepts that message or not is up to them and to you.
Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.